In today's vlog, I'm going to continue down the same path that I've been going down, which is to take previous information and to validate it through sources and find out where some of the stuff had come from. One of the most recent books that I've been reading through, not very far, first couple chapters still, is The Magus by Francis Barrett, written in 1801. So this book has got some very interesting things. It starts out talking about a lot of Christian mythology and ideas, sort of like starting with Adam and Eve with the Garden of Eden and the fruit of wisdom that gave them understanding. And it talks about understanding how to work with magic by understanding the natural world. Magic is natural and it comes from God. It's a very interesting approach considering most people who explore esoteric occultism today have a tendency to be polytheistic, pagan if you will, neo-pagan specifically. So that's kind of like, okay, did the modern neo-pagan stuff get influenced by writers like this? I actually think they have. And looking at some of his stuff and where he might have gotten it kind of led me to the conclusion that maybe a lot of the stuff that people do as far as practices, whether it be magic, mysticism, occult stuff, or religion and spirituality, is more focused on the individual cultures that the people grew up in rather than the individual religions. I think the names for things change, but the world that we live in and how the world functions stays the same, which is why one of the terms that one of the phrases per se that I had heard previously was yesterday's magic is today's science. And there's been many situations where people will bring up modern science is built off of old occultism. Modern science, of course, will not be too thrilled of pointing that out. Like, no, that's different. They were just based upon belief, but it started somewhere. And the approach to the writing that is done by Francis Barrett as he collects previous editions. Most of the stuff wasn't actually created by Francis Barrett that's in this book. Instead, rather, it's an accumulation of other occult practitioners. But he takes almost a scientific-like approach to its collection. So it's really interesting to read. Highly recommend it. So now I'm going to flip with my little cool animation here where we change the background, and we're going to pull up the Magus. So there's a couple ways to get a hold of this book, and apparently it's a very popular book in occult circles because of what it covers. This particular project here, and of course I will share all these links below as I typically do in my videos, this is arthistoryproject.com. And on this page here, not only do they show a really cool image of the Magus, one printing of it, but it kind of goes down and it breaks it down and talks about some of the history behind it. You know, the Magus, book 1, the rarest of the 19th century grimoires. In the decades between Newton and Darwin, and 100 years into the Age of Enlightenment, the eccentric occult philosopher Francis Barrett translated and compiled a massive compendium of magical knowledge. Published in 1801, the Magus contained selections from Cornelius Agrippa's third and fourth books of occult philosophy, the Heptameron, if I'm saying that right, of Peter Abano, and writings by Zoroaster, Apollonius, and many other early magicians. I want to point out here, Zoroastrianism was one of the things that I had tracked down for the origin of the use of the term magic. It actually comes out of that. The Zoroastrian religion actually still exists today over in the East, and apparently there was a lot of ceremonial magical stuff associated with that, which is why people use the term magic. We'll cover magic in a separate video, but it's interesting to point that out. Together in one volume, the Magus became one of the most sought-after occult books of the 19th and 20th centuries, influencing occultist Eliphas Levi, the practices of the Fraternal Order, the Golden Dawn, which many of you may have heard of, I've heard mentioned many times, and remains one of the foundations of ceremonial magic practice to this day. So there is, of course, a link there. I will send a link to this website. If you scroll down, this is actually a printing of the book, because it's in the public domain, because of how old it is. So you can actually click and read pieces of this book. Now, I did mention earlier one of the sections talking about God, so I am going to pull up one of the pages in this book, which is interesting. And this is a prayer or oration to God. Almighty and most merciful God, why thy servants approach with fear and trembling before thee. Like, it literally has a prayer starting out with God in this book, which again, I just think it's interesting because a lot of people try to take occult and esoteric practice and associate it specifically with polytheism and neo-paganism. One of the most recent conversations I've been having with my wife recently is she found on TikTok an individual who says they're a Christian witch. Now, in the past, you would have asked us 10 or 15 years ago, we would say that's not possible. But looking at some of the approach and the thought behind what magic is and how you can interpret it in different fashions kind of could work with any religion or spirituality. If you're talking about its natural and part of the world, well, now it comes down to, how do you believe the world came into existence? Did it come into existence by a singular god? Did it come into existence by a pantheon of gods? Or maybe there is no deity or spirit or anything, there's just is existence. So it all depends on the belief behind it, but that doesn't change the symbolic nature of working with what is actually there out in nature. So it's just a fascinating approach, in my opinion. Another source that you can check out, of course, is sacredtext.com, which is partially cut off in my view over here. I guess I could drag this over so folks can actually see it. Oh, look at that. We can actually see what's going on now. So there's multiple sections and chapters in this. Now, the Magus itself is actually broken into 2 books, and the second book covers a slew of different topics, and the third book, which is more recent apparently, there's a third one that kind of pulls and kind of summarizes thoughts. So that wasn't necessarily written specifically by Francis Barrett, but I do think it's important to point out that he pulled together different ones. Now, I had part 1 on Kindle, and with with my additional research, I actually ended up picking up a new version, which you can see here on my Kindle Paperwhite. That's the one that I'm reading through right now. This is actually all 3 books. So if you were to go to Kindle, you could pick up a complete system of occult philosophy, books 1, 2, and 3. It says "and rare." It should be a rare 19th century grimoire illustrated edition. So that's the one I'm reading through right now. I do recommend picking it up there, or you can check out one of the sites and check it out for free. So who's Francis Barrett? One of the places that I ended up going to kind of check out and figure out what's going on is information about Francis himself. So apparently, Francis Barrett here, 19th century, was a British magician, was the author of the Magus, or Celestial Influencer, which apparently are the 2 different names for this collection. And it just kind of goes in detail about what the book is supposed to be and where he acquired his knowledge from. So there's this other individual, Ebenezer Sibley, from 1751, passed away in 1799, which was also an individual who collected occult knowledge and was really big into herbalism and different he was a Baptist, apparently. He was into different types of esoteric magic as well. So these are practicing magicians who gathered together sources and information to keep them alive so that they didn't disappear with time. And apparently, I have no idea how to say this, it looks like Rosicrucian, but apparently Barrett was claimed to be part of this order, which, yeah, I know this is Wikipedia, but I looked it up on Wikipedia, and apparently they're like an esoteric order of the Rose Cross, and they're basically kind of like an occult brotherhood that tries to keep things together. And here you go again with Hermeticism and talking about Hermetics, like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So very interesting to know where this might have come from and the fact that it might be older. One of the conversations that I've been having, because I like to have conversations, I love talking in case that's not clear by me talking into a microphone and at a camera on a regular basis, is I was talking to my younger brother. I was talking about the sources of magic, and that a lot of people who are in modern neo-pagan circles will make this claim that they own magic and they own seasonal stuff, and Christians and Abrahamic faiths stole it from us and it's ours. And I constantly counter that by saying we need to acknowledge the fact that this belongs to the people outside and it's part of the culture, and that if anything, you should be grateful to the Christians for keeping it alive. Individuals like Francis Barrett or Ebenezer Sibley, they wrote it down. Otherwise, how would you have access to it? So is it older? Potentially. More than likely. Has it been influenced and changed? Sure. One of the pictures I tried to paint with my word art is to try to think of it like a pot. If you're making a stew. If you make a stew and you just dump it out and start cooking something else inside of it, it's going to have influences from the original stew. And then if you dump that soup out and then try to go back to a different stew, I almost think of this like what we're talking about with some of these traditions that we incorporate in spirituality. The stew is what we're calling today paganism, because that's not what they called it back then. And we dumped it out and filled it with Christianity. Well, the culture is still there. The society is still there. And some of the things survived at the bottom of the pot because it wasn't like scrubbed clean. And then we made the soup. There's Christianity. So it's going to have some of those flavors from that original stew. But now we're dumping that out and we're putting stew back in. Well, the soup still influenced what was left in that pot, and that soup is still going to be having its residue behind as well. So anything that we have today, when people say that Christianity has pagan DNA, I would argue that neo-paganism has Christian DNA. People probably don't want to hear that, but it's a fact. We need to acknowledge what is and not live in a world where we're just going to make things fit what we believe versus actual facts. So take it for what it is, like it, dislike it. Here's another page that talks, it's occultworld.com. I don't know how accurate they are, but it is, there's plenty of writings out there about Francis Barrett to check out about who he was and information about his life, which we don't know a lot about his younger life. We just know, again, that he collected this stuff and it was other people's works that he put together. So yeah, that's the Magus. Here's another page on it that I am also going to put below. So I'm going to share some of these links below that just talk about some of this information that I'm saying and just kind of backs it back up. I do also think it's interesting to point out some of the practices that a lot of these individuals are to and some of the sources that they shared, people that helped to influence them, and some of the people that he actually included in his book. So I would look up next, what I'm going to do, and I would also recommend you do the same, is to look up some of these authors that he's drawing from and maybe compare sources and see if Francis adjusted stuff. I also think it's also interesting, like I said, the individual practices here. It says it included sections on astrology, arithmancy, Kabbalistic magic, and the techniques for scrying. So Kabbalistic, Kabbalah, like there's different ways of spelling, and I've recently looked this up as well. There are apparently 3 different forms of Kabbalah. So when it's with a Q, they're typically referring to the original roots, which is Jewish mysticism. When it's spelled with a K, that's typically seems to be what New Age type of practitioners have a tendency to spell it with. And apparently there's also with a C, which is the Christian version of it. So these Kabbalistic ceremonial practices that do have a tendency to get pretty old have been utilized as an underlining form of practice within ceremonial magic. So when people talk about ceremonial magic, there is a similarity with the different traditions and stuff, because I believe potentially that many of those, if not all of those traditions, come back from a singular source, or at least people who started a particular path knew each other, so there's that connection and tie-in, and that's why you're going to see some similarities. I also think that we see similarities because as humans we have a natural tendency and we have a nature to do stuff. Like if we want to show reverence for something, bowing our head or lowering ourselves below them to put them up higher, both physically and symbology wise, putting your hands together in a prayer position. You have seen this throughout different cultures because I think this is human nature, that the symbolism of trying to do an act of what something means and representing it, this is instinctual. So I think a lot of people from different cultures are going to come up with similar ideas when it comes to different types of ways of practicing, believing, and honoring. So it doesn't necessarily mean it all came from one source. There's also the possibility of this is just human nature. So I think we have to look at all of that when we go exploring down these rabbit holes, because they are rabbit holes and they can definitely go on for some time. So thank you for sitting through this little vlog share of where I'm currently looking and some of the things that I'm reading about. Share your thoughts. Have you actually read the Magus? And if you have not, have you at least heard of it? If you have heard of it and you haven't read it yet, do you think you might want to? Me, I couldn't stay away from someone who has had such an interest when it comes to arcane occult philosophy and spellcraft for over 30 years. And I've read a lot of different people who repeat a lot of the same information. I never really knew why. The thought and the idea of going back to where it might have all started from is very tempting and definitely something I want to spend some time with. So I'm going to continue to read the Magus. Maybe I'll make some future videos on it. But anyway, as always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.